There you go. Okay. Thank you for reminding me.
The 5 stages in the revelation of God's judgment. If we take a close look at all the different stages of revelation or concealment of God's attribute of judgment in the world, we will find them arranged in a precise order, one after another. There are 5 stages, as I will demonstrate. You will see them in their time phases from the beginning of history to the ultimate perfection of the world, which will take place at the end of days. The first time phase was the entire first 2,000 years of history, known as the 2,000 years of desolation, which reached their most extreme point during the Egyptian exile. During such a phase, God conceals his presence completely, and it seems as if he has abandoned the world. God forbid, neither seeing nor hearing what man is doing. Then it is considered that God's attribute of judgment does not act upon the world at all. It exists only in a state of potential necessary for the world's existence and obligated by the system through which he guides the world. In his love for his creations, he observes them and considers, as it were, what needs to be done to them in order to bring them to their ultimate perfection. However, he only considers what to do to them, but does not actually carry it out. He hides his proper judgment and leaves the world in a situation of desolation and turmoil. I need to interrupt you for a moment, so I won't be confused by your explanation. You have mentioned more than once something that I am unable to understand. What is that? You said that when God conceals his attributes of judgment, the world does not function properly and enters a state of desolation and turmoil. Now you have to admit to me one of 2 possibilities. Either the world is run through God's attribute of loving kindness or through his attribute of judgment. If it is run through loving kindness, everything is in a state of good, and there can be no source for the creation and continuing existence of evil. If it is run through judgment, it is possible to say that this attribute of judgment has been concealed. On the contrary, not all the terrible things in the world actually caused by the manifestation of God's judgment and his attribute of strict justice. I will substantiate this claim with 2 proofs. Firstly, all evil and deficiency are brought into existence by means of God's attribute of strict justice together with his concealment of his goodness, as you've already explained to me at great length earlier, chapter 5, part 1, and end of chapter 5, part 2. Secondly, you told me that this concealment comes about because of man's sins, and God hides his presence from the world. If that is the case, surely this is a manifestation of God's attribute of judgment. You've certainly asked a good question. I will now explain all these matters clearly, so you will no longer be confused. I already clarified to you earlier that the whole existence of good and evil in this world stems from the fact that God concealed his infinite goodness. He made use of this attribute, which allows evil to exist through the concealment of his presence, as it says. He made darkness through his concealment. The attribute has 2 different forms. The first form allows evil to become strong and gain great power. Then, God does not make use of his attribute of judgment in order to remove this evil from the world by inflicting punishment on the wicked. If he would do that, then once he has been punished, he is again like your brother. Instead, the consequence of God hiding his presence is that the world becomes overrun by evil and cannot be healed. The second form of this attribute also depends on the concealment of God's presence, but it is good for the world and its inhabitants. All the elements of the Anhaga, i.e. the system through which God runs the world, are arranged in such a way that perfect justice is administered. As a result of this, the world is cleansed of evil. This does not come about through God's attribute of loving kindness, which cancels out men's sins as if they had never happened. Instead, it comes about through the enforcing of judgment, which removes all evil through punishment. Until the time comes when God wipes out all sins through the power of his absolute sovereignty, the only way to cleanse the world is through the enforcement of true judgment. Therefore, when I use the term attribute of judgment, I mean the true judgment that cleanses the world of evil. When this judgment is not carried out, the situation becomes one of destruction rather than rectification. Sins are not wiped out. On the contrary, the world seems to be despised and evil predominates. Then the Anhaga of the world is through great concealment. God's presence becomes hidden from his creations and the world enters desolation and turmoil. However, you need to be aware of the following fundamental principle. God never despises his handiwork, and he never abandons the world, leaving it to its own devices. On the contrary, when the world seems as if he has abandoned it, he is in fact preparing a new influx of good. His wondrous deeds and his thoughts are constantly directed towards the perfection of the world and not towards its destruction. It is just that he conceals his plan to a very great extent. Consequently, the world seems abandoned, while people suffer the punishment for their sins. This is what our sages were alluding to in this comment about our forefather Yaakov. Israel said, why do you do harm to me? Rabbi Levi said in the name of Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina, these are the only incorrect words our forefather Yaakov ever spoke. God said, I am busy making his son the king of Egypt, while he says, why did you do harm to me? This is the meaning of the verse. Why does Yaakov say, what is happening to me is hidden from God? Meaning of the sage's words in that throughout the whole time Yaakov was in anguish because of his separation from Yosef, God was actually guiding the entire series of events in order to make Yosef king and enable Yaakov to live in tranquility. However, because this plan was so deeply hidden, Yaakov experienced suffering. This example is a paradigm for man's experience in this world. Every elevation or improvement that God wishes to bestow upon man or the world is always preceded by pain. The reason for this is that the whole process through which this good is being prepared takes place only on a deeply hidden level. This is similar to the concept that our sages were expressing when they said, God gave 3 special gifts to the Jewish people, i.e. the Torah, the land of Israel, and the world to come, and all of them are only acquired through suffering. Let's now return to the subject of our discussion. The first of the various stages of the world's development is when God's judgment is hidden and does not manifest itself. Consequently, the world is not purged of evil. At such a time, God's existence is not recognized in the world. We have already stated, beginning of chapter 7, part 3, that the Egyptian exile was the principal time when this came about.
Okay, Jason, let's take a break. Well, okay, you want to make a summary? Lev, you following?
I think so. I'm hesitant to make a summary, but I could take a stab.
Hang on 1 second. Okay, go for it.
Okay, so we understand that God is always is always running the world through
Right.
the Hagah, through his whole system of attributes, and that I think what we discussed was the attribute of just judgment as well as the attribute of concealment, perhaps, or maybe the absence, and that sometimes when things are really dark and really bad, it's not that or when his emanations are decreased or diminished and the evil is like growing, it's only so that it can then be destroyed and bring about its own destruction, so that following that something better is going to come out, and that the emanation will then again increase.
Like that. So you're saying in a simple way, God's attribute of justice can work in one of 2 ways, right? What is justice? Justice is bring about justice, correct the wrongs that have been done. So there are two ways that God might correct the wrongs that have been done. Either punishment, a person does a sin and they are punished, they suffer pain, that corrects the sin. Or God says, the correction of this evil is to let it run its course and be destroyed in the end. And then a new good can arise, a new potential can arise. Right? So I think the example of Jacob and Joseph, right? So Joseph is sold and Yaakov is very pained for 20 years. He's very pained. So he says to God, what did I do to deserve this? And God, the way the Midrash says it is, God is saying, you didn't actually do anything to deserve this. But what's happening is the result of selling Yosef, the way that corrected was that it landed up that he became the viceroy of Egypt, and a new good came out of that. Not sure, I wouldn't call that evil destroying itself, but something in the future, it allows for some good in the future to be reestablished.
Without the evil, if everything was, you're right. I shouldn't interrupt, but yeah,
No, it's okay.
Having the destruction of the evil allows the contrast and then the reaction for the good to grow, or putting out the
forest fires are good.
Fire.
Right? Forest fires are good. At the time it's terrible, but actually it really rejuvenates the earth and the forest in a that's where we see it in nature, I guess. I don't know, Jason, are you understanding it this way? You have anything else?
I guess it's like he said you have this potential, things being pregnant with something and then sort of gives birth to it, and then it's as though you have to, you have to lift whatever object up to a height. And that's your potential energy, and that was the work you had to take to get there, the evil you had to suffer through, and then that object will become realized as it goes downhill and powers whatever
Interesting.
good thing that is happening to you, based on collective suffering that happened, not necessarily specifically to you, that you suffered and now you benefit from it, but the collective suffered and now the world can benefit. So I don't know. That's like, I don't think it's saying like, if you do good, you will have good things, or if you suffer, you'll have good things happen to you, but other people may have good things happen to them.
Interesting, right?
Or the world, as the world works.
The metaphor that you said of the forest fire reminded me of a different, or it made me think of another metaphor of the volcano, because what worse kind of a situation can you imagine than the earth exploding from underneath you? But then you go to Hawaii and the live volcanoes are there, but look at what it created, just like paradise. The tropics and the plants and the animals and the land and the water. It's like, you have this thing at the time, it's just absolute evil. Like the earth is exploding. It seems like it's evil. So that's have you ever been to Hawaii?
I have. Have you?
Yes. It's like, it's just like.
Have you, Jason?
I went when I was very, very small, but then again, I went for a conference about 10 years ago or so, maybe a little bit less, 2000, yeah, 10 years ago. And it is beautiful.
Spectacular.
We just went to Kauai. Where did you go, Lev?
I went to the Big Island and Maui,
Oh, really?
and so we saw the volcano, and I photographed the volcano at night, and it was really just kind of like the bubbling redness, and you could barely see, you could see some smoke, but I did this long exposure, and it made the sky kind of red and spooky, and it was
Great.
phenomenal. It was just phenomenal. Oh, so beautiful. And the beaches and the water and
Yeah, it's something else. Okay, let's continue. 4:15.
The second stage is a time such as ours, when there are no prophets or seers. We do not experience miracles and wonders that would obligate everyone to recognize God's greatness. However, God's presence is slightly more apparent in the world than during the previous stage, and there is some knowledge of his greatness. The Egyptian exile was certainly the most severe exile in our entire history. The Jewish people were immersed in servitude. They did not have the Torah, and they were not a distinct nation with their own laws and commandments as they are today. Furthermore, there was no knowledge whatsoever of God's name in the world. Now we have the Torah, and so even though we are in exile, it is not considered a time of total desolation like the first 2,000 years of history. Now, as I mentioned, we have the Torah, which was given to us from heaven as our eternal possession, thank God, and his name is known among the nations. The third stage is a time when God reveals his total dominion over the world with
I guess
miracles and wonders.
Right? If there's 6,000 years, the first 2,000 were what's called Tahu Avahu, right? Desolation. The next 2,000 are what's called the 2,000 years of Torah. We have the Torah and we're trying to work it out. And then the third stage is the next, the time when Mashiach could come, I think that the Talmud says, okay?
The third stage is a time when God reveals his total dominion of the world with miracles and wonders performed before all the nations of the world in order that it should be known that he is the God of the Jewish people. This occurs during the period of the first Beis Hamikdash and the second Beis Hamikdash. However, you should understand that even this revelation was essentially external in nature, since it came about only through the external agency of manifest miracles. Had these miracles not taken place, people would not have had clear faith. This is not the ultimate revelation of his glory that he wishes to bring about in the world. The fourth stage is when God's glory is
Okay,
revealed
so
to all.
that's still within the 2,000 years of Torah. That's a development within the 2,000 years of Torah about, I guess, what a world would look like with God clearly in it, but in a somewhat an external way. Okay.
The fourth stage is when God's glory is revealed to all his creatures in such a way that it can be grasped through inner knowledge and direct experience rather than through the external agency of miracles. Then they will see and experience his glory through an outpouring of knowledge and wisdom. We find this concept expressed in the verses: the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God in the water as the water covers the seabed. They will see God's glory with their own eyes when he returns his presence to Zion. God's glory will be revealed and all living things together will see. And they will not need miracles and wonders to verify their belief. Rather, it will be based on knowledge and direct experience, just as with all the angels know God through their own experience. This knowledge is absolutely clear and true and does not leave any room for doubt. This was the level of awareness the entire Jewish people attained at Mount Sinai, as is written. God spoke with you face to face from amidst the fire. I spoke to you from the heavens, in order that the people will hear me speaking to you, and they will have faith in you as well forever. This is in order that man's belief not be based on the external agency of miracles, since if any doubt concerning the veracity of those miracles would arise, man's whole belief system would crumble. Rather, at this fourth stage, belief is based on clear knowledge attained through the personal observation and experience that does not leave any room for doubt. However, man's existence has higher levels than this. It is self-evident that the higher and more refined the level of his being will become in the future, the greater will be his awareness and knowledge. This is the essential element of the fifth stage, a time of constant spiritual elevation as man's level of existence and awareness grow ever higher. Until God's guidance and dominion of the world are properly revealed for the first time through true knowledge during the previous stage, it is considered that God's judgment of the world is not yet apparent and his dominion not fully established. But once such a revelation has been experienced for the first time, God's judgment becomes known, and from then on there is only additional revelation and elevation. These elevations will be experienced after the first complete revelation has taken place during the fourth stage described above. And God will purify the people's state of existence and grant them further revelations of his glory and greatness according to the extent of their purification. These are all the stages that God made for the revelation of his attribute of judgment from beginning to end. One, in the first stage, his judgment only reaches the point where it ought to exist. It is being prepared for that existence, but has not yet actually come into being. Two, after that, it becomes somewhat revealed, yet it cannot be considered properly revealed since it still needs the additional elements of wonders and miracles that will attest to its truth. Three, once it has been revealed with these signs, the elements necessary for the revelation of God's judgment are complete, but the nature of this revelation is still external. Four, there is a further stage of revelation when God's judgment will be experienced from within, that is to say, through true knowledge and awareness. The actual essence of its judgment will be experienced. Five, after that, there will be additional extra revelations according to the increased levels of those who are fitting to experience them. I'll now explain to you something very nice, how each of these levels of development has a parallel in our world.
Right.
I'm certainly eager to hear this.
Basically, I think he goes into the explanation of a birth of a baby.
Right. Human development.
The development, right. I'm certainly eager to hear this. I thought you were saying that.
What?
I thought that was what he was saying, not that the book said that. I thought Jason's
also eager to hear. Okay. Go on.
Look at the various stages of humans' development. Since God is not limited in any way, had he wanted, he could certainly have caused man to be born completely formed, but he did not do that. Instead, see how incomplete and helpless man is on the day of his birth, only gradually developing little by little. This is a perfect representation of the gradual development of God's glory and Hanhaga during the process of revelation of his absolute power as he carefully directs the world through the 5 stages we have mentioned. These stages are the growth process of the world as it gradually develops and are just like the growth process of a person from birth to maturity. They are the precise stages through which God's glory gradually reveals itself in the world. A human being's existence originates through the union of the partners in his creation, his father and his mother. Parents correspond to the causative forces behind the existence of everything in the world. However, the new being is still enclosed within his mother's womb during all the months of pregnancy. 2, after that, he is born and emerges into the environment of the world. Then he continues to grow very gradually, step by step. He is not yet fully developed either in his physical form or in his mental faculties. This only happens when he reaches full maturity. 3, initially his mind develops to the point that he becomes obliged to keep the mitzvahs at the age of 13. Nevertheless, he is not yet fully developed and is still immature. 4, subsequently completes the process of development, reaching full maturity. 5, from that point on, he attains more and more elevated levels as he grows older. The splendor of old age, the crown of more advanced years, and the wisdom of elders acquired through the passage of years. This whole process is a reflection of the various stages through which God guides the world, which we mentioned above. Consequently, man, who is the focus of the system of guidance, reflects within himself the system through which God guides him. We already spoke about this concept earlier, chapter 4, part 3. It certainly makes perfect sense that the form of man should hint at the most exalted secrets of how God acts upon the world. This principle applies to all the other creatures in the world as well. Each of them is a reflection of one of the secrets of his Hanhaga. Supreme intelligence devised that each part of his Hanhaga should be represented in this world. This is what gives rise to the multitude of different creatures, each kind of creature being a reflection of one part of the system. All the various aspects of each created thing, the details of its form and its qualities, are the way they are because of the particular aspects of the part of the system which they are meant to reflect. Thus, all of God's attributes are like roots, while his creations are part of the actual branches that stem from them. This is because the existence of the various creatures depend on the existence of the various attributes. Prophetic visions of the prophets are also a direct result of this principle. And God wants to show them one of his attributes. He shows them a prophetic vision in the form of a lion or an ox, or in any of the other forms that appear in these prophecies. This is self-evident.
Okay.
I'm sure it was quite self-evident.
That was it, right?
Yeah, that's part 3.
That ending, that was like so much more comprehensible. The whole piece about the human development, it just like brings it back down to earth. Like I remember reading this and being like, oh, I could sit and read this. It wasn't like as much of a
Right.
difficulty to hop it.
Well, what I struggle with is, okay, so this God's judgment, right? God's judgment is developing. So what is, let's take the term justice. So, in the first 2,000 years, where was justice? In the second stage, where's justice? Third stage, etc., etc. It's very interesting. I understand the revelation of justice, the revelation of God's justice, I guess, increases as time does. But what does that mean for actual justice? Does it just mean in the initial stages it's more hidden, harder to comprehend, works in a different way, or there is less justice? One could argue that, if the world is like a baby, like a human developing, so it's not that responsible actually for the first few years, right? So maybe that those first 2,000 years really, yeah, God was like, okay, well, work it out. It's like a little baby. They do silly things or bad things, and parent doesn't really criticize them. And then when it came to Egypt, that was already like, okay, now you're like an adolescent, right? So let the people go, or I'm going to punish you. And that was like the 10 punishments that, the 10 plagues are God punishing this little child who's not so little anymore, who should know better. And then after that, these different other stages, I guess each one has its justice. It's very complex. All right, should we? Yeah, we're quite early. Let's go into the next bit. Let's go into the next bit and see if we can make head or tail of it. Jason, you want to continue reading?
Okay. Part 4, what causes the changes in the revelation of God's attributes within the world? Rabbi, we will now complete the subject we were discussing. According to what we have explained, we can see that each divine attribute has 2 aspects: its actual content and the power with which it operates. That is to say, how much it actualizes that content at any one time. For example, the general attribute of judgment consists of all the different ways through which reward and punishment are applied to the world, whether through kindness or rebuke. This can be divided into three principal categories: the attribute of loving kindness, the attribute of strict justice, and the attribute of compassion. However, the extent to which God's judgment is able to actualize itself through these categories varies at different times. When this ability increases, the revelation of God's judgment increases. When it decreases, the revelation of its judgment decreases. What can this be compared? To human beings who have all the same physical structure, and yet their levels of ability vary a great deal. One person is able to do things that another cannot do. And even within the same person, the level of their ability varies from one time to another. This is self-evident. So too, in this matter, God directs the world at all times through his attribute of judgment and maintains all the laws of creation which are dependent on the ways of his judgment. Yet sometimes this attribute is more actualized and sometimes it is more concealed, as we have explained. This also accounts for the difference between the various days of the year, why some days are holy and others are not. The difference between them is caused by the increase or decrease in the revelation of his emanation of holiness in the world, as we will explain more fully later on, God willing. We know that all the elements of the Haganah have been determined, each element and its particular causes. Therefore, these causes certainly must be sufficient for everything we are able to distinguish in the world. Consequently, we'll need to gain a detailed understanding of these causes and how they bring about what they do. In this way, we will be able to understand the changes that take place in the world. However, in order to comprehend this properly, we'll have to go into greater depth, as you will now hear. Student, what is wrong with the ways we have been looking at things until now? Are these concepts not sufficient for us to understand the way the world is run? Rabbi, everything we have said until now is perfectly fine. Nevertheless, we need to know the nature of the guided creature is defined by the objective of the Haggah. In any particular phase time, the nature of the creatures and everything that happens to them changes in order to reflect and correspond to the Haggah. This is the greater depth of understanding that I say we must now attain. You've already learned that this lowly world is dark and inferior place, and that everything that happens in it is of a dark and inferior nature. Chapter 4, Part 2. You've also learned that everything in existence came into being only through God's will, and that its continued existence depends on his decree and divine utterance. Chapter 3, Part 5. We can therefore see that the fact that the world is a place of darkness must certainly be a result of God's divine utterance, which establishes it in this form. Obviously, had God wanted, he could have significantly brightened the darkness and made the world more elevated and refined. Now there is profound wisdom involved in the understanding of all the different levels of elevation and lowliness that man and the world have to go through. Therefore, an examination of these levels will provide us with a vast field of investigation and analysis. In fact, there is no end to the details of such an analysis. However, the general categories are not so numerous, and they are very important keys for understanding some of the great secrets of the way God acts on the world. I will now add that when God chose to direct the world through the attribute of judgment, which involves the whole system of reward and punishment, it became necessary for good and evil to exist in the world. Consequently, it will also become necessary for man to be formed and guided in such a way that he could equally be affected by good and evil. If had chosen to direct the world according to his true goodness and loving kindness, then all living creatures would be completed and perfected through the light of his presence. There would not be any evil in the world, and man would exist on a far higher level, unaffected by evil. His being would be filled only with goodness, splendor, light, and wisdom. We can therefore see that man's lowly or elevated state of being is a consequence of how God wants to direct his existence. According to what God wants to achieve in his direction of man in any particular phase, he causes man to exist in an appropriate state and form. The lowly status of the world is therefore a consequence of God's attribute of judgment, which causes every aspect of the world to be lowly and inferior. This is what I explained to you earlier with regard to God's emanation of creative power, chapter 5, part 2. There I stated that since this is a direct emanation from God, it should really be an emanation of great holiness, giving rise to magnificent and majestic things. However, God chose to envelop his emanation in a lonely form, though this was unfitting for it, since this is what was needed for this lowly world to achieve its purpose. Sorry. Nevertheless, if we look more closely, we'll see that although the world is lowly and dark, it is not completely dark without any light at all. It does have some elements illuminating it. The darkness we recognize in the world is the animal-like physicality that prevails in it. Nevertheless, it is not completely devoid of certain elements of light that come from whatever is spiritual and not physical. Man at least has knowledge and wisdom, and on a higher level there is Torah and divine inspiration. All of these are not of the nature of physicality. All this teaches us that the world consists of a combination of darkness and light. We need to understand the varying levels of darkness and light that combine together during all the various phases of time. We will need to identify the levels of darkness by themselves and the levels of light by themselves. This way, we will come to an understanding of the nature of all the changing events of the world. And we have already learned, chapter 4, part 2, 1, what the darkness and light in the world consist of, and 2, what their source is. 1, darkness consists of all the aspects of physicality and bodily drives, while light consists of everything spiritual. This is what distinguishes the lowly beings of this world, which lack holiness, from the holy beings of the higher worlds, which consist exclusively of light without any admixture of physicality. The source of darkness is the fact that God does not transmit an emanation of holiness, as would have been appropriate for a divine emanation. He transmits instead an emanation that corresponds to the lowly nature of this world. The source of light is the fact that God transmits a spiritual emanation of true divine holiness.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it sounds, this sounds very repetitive, right? But it's quite a good summary of what we've learned. Let's see, because what are we trying to understand over here, right? That what is God doing, right? What's the Hanaga? What is the what are these levels of the emanation? Just like God's emanation of oneness, of goodness is limited, or he limited it, so too justice goes through different phases. Okay, so let's see.
Like Lev was capturing one of those lowly forms of
Sorry?
Lev was catching a bug or something like that.
Yes. You know those. If you watch the video later, it flew and hit me in the face. I was like looking up, and then boom, it just hit me in the face.
Really?
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, are you okay, Lev? Okay, now. Whew.
There's some schools of thought that think when a mosquito bites a person in a specific place, that there was a reason that you were bit there, and there was some kind of other, like, there was a reason for it. Like there was like I can't explain it, but I've heard that there's some thoughts about.
Okay.
I can't explain it, but I'm telling you.
Okay.
Like you needed that attention to this physical spot. You get this itch. It's like, I don't know. It's like some kind of other. I don't know. I can't bring anything else to it, but try to keep my mouth shut. But digress. I'm gonna go back on mute.
Okay. Okay, Jason, now.
Now, when God chooses to guide the world through his attribute of judgment, he makes the guidance subservient in a certain sense to the actions of man. As a result, man's good deeds cause God to bestow good upon the world, whereas his bad deeds cause God to withhold this good from the world, as I explained to you earlier. Chapter 3, part 3, and part 1 of this chapter. In contrast, when God chooses to run the world purely through his attribute of loving kindness, he makes use of his absolute sovereignty, which is not subservient to any law and is not dependent on the created world. As it says, I will act exclusively for my own sake. At such a time, there is no evil at all, only good. Therefore, when God will direct the world through his attribute of loving kindness and his absolute sovereignty, as I've just explained, he will transmit a divine emanation of holiness to the entire world. which will cause everything to become holy, as is written. And the remnants in Sion and the remainder in Yerushalayim will be called holy. But when he chooses to guide it with his judgment, he does not transmit a spiritual emanation. Instead, he transmits an emanation fitting only for physicality. Based on what we have said, there are three levels of divine emanation. One, an emanation that gives rise to physicality and produces this world in its lowly form. Two, a purely spiritual emanation that causes the whole world to conduct itself with total holiness in all of its elements. And three, an emanation that causes spiritual light to dwell within the physical. That is to say, it allows the existence of spiritual things even during the time of our physical world. These spiritual elements do not transform the physical in the same way as the second emanation we mentioned. Rather, this third type of emanation simply joins the spiritual light to the physical to the extent that it is appropriate, without actually removing the darkness of physicality. It is therefore not the second type, which actually removes this darkness. Although this emanation is inferior to the second type, it is still derived from it, since its existence is also spiritual and full of light. God, the creator of all existence, brought all these three types of emanation into being. There is an emanation that transforms everything it affects into something completely holy. From this emanation is derived another type, which sanctifies whatever it affects, but does not transform it. See, furthermore, he brought into existence the first type of emanation that I mentioned above, an emanation that gives rise only to the physical. In addition, he joined these last two types together in specific combinations according to his purpose. These combinations are prone to change. At certain times, the components increase, and at other times, they decrease. This causes changes in the nature of the world itself. Due to the combination of these two emanations, even within the physical man, there are elements of spiritual light. In particular, the Torah exists in the world, and divine inspiration can be found within man, as we explained. This is the principal reason for the change between the ordinary days of the week and the days of special sanctity in the cycle of time. When the emanation of holiness, B, increases its connection with the emanation of physicality, C. Spiritual light increases its effects on the physical within man. Shabbos is the holiest of all the days of the year because at that time God greatly increases the amount of divine spiritual emanation that comes down to the world, as we mentioned. All the other holy days, the Yomim Tovim, follow the same principle, each one at its particular level. These are days when the amount of spiritual emanation that comes down to the world is increased in accordance with their respective levels.
All right.
Well, now to explain.
Let's just okay, let's get to 153 and discuss that.
We'll now explain to you another important principle. I already described how man's spiritual status was diminished from the beginning of his creation and how this status was even further diminished after Adam's sin, chapter 6, part 1. The level of this physical at the previous higher level became the level of the spiritual at the subsequent lower level. The world needs to elevate itself and remove the effects of these diminishments. And in fact, the world is guided towards this goal, as we have explained earlier, chapter 3, part 3. However, the world first needs to complete itself at this lowest level. It came about after the sin by maximizing the amount of divine light that can possibly come at this level. Then it'll be able to rise to the next level and receive everything appropriate for it at that new level. This process will then repeat itself as it rises level to level. Student, certainly all these principles are essential in order to understand the different circumstances of man in his world and what is decreed for him in all of these times.
Okay. What are you getting out of this? The three emanations. So what's that? I'm trying to think of a good parable for this. Maybe energy, you know. So sometimes, let's say you're exhausted, right? You've only got enough energy to really just survive, right? You're not very capable of much movement, much thought, much speech, much of anything. but you definitely are surviving. So that we would call, that's the lowest level of energy. Then there is, when you're feeling healthy, you're awake, you're energized, you can do what you need to do. So that's kind of the middle, right? That's like the next level. You've now got, you've got some energy. You feel like you have energy. It's not just the body, but you feel energized. You can do things. And then the third level is when you feel inspired, right? You get you get an idea that's like, whoa, or something happens to you, and you're like, you go beyond the normal feeling of feeling good to ecstatic, right? You go to a place where your energy is full, and you just are super able. So that corresponds to these three really basic three general levels. I'm sure there's gray within all of them, of God's emanation. So one is just the physical, two is the other really spiritual, angelic, and the three is the middle level, where it's more than just physical, but not yet angelic. It's got the aspect of what I'm sure you've heard this, people speak about, the novelty of Torah is that we uplift that which is physical. We don't abstain from it. It's a way of being makadesh. It's a way of bringing spirituality into the physicality. Okay. And therefore, I guess those are, so let's try use those three states to understand the attribute of justice. Yeah, it sounds like, the first stage is it's there, but it's very dormant, not doing much. The second stage is it's there, but not in its full sense and power. And the third, highest level, is when it's completely revealed and felt and in everything. And that's, yeah.
Can I give you a parable?
Sure, please.
This kind of dawned on me with the language of the emanation of light and the clarity of, I just have this inclination to look to photography and the ideas of the lens aperture. And so when it's dark and there's not as much emanation or there's not as much light, you open up the lens really wide. And when you do open up the lens really wide, you have a very shallow depth of field so that you can only see the subject. Okay, so but if the light increases, then you can stop down. When you stop down, then you might be able to see the subject and the background won't be maybe out of focus anymore. So you can get more information about what's going on in the world. Then if the light increases even more, you stop down even further and you can see from the foreground, the subject, and the background to infinity. So you can actually, so maybe with more light in a photograph, you can capture the foreground, the subject, and the background, so that maybe it seems similar metaphorically, the emanations of the light. we can resolve more. We'll be able to see, oh, this is how things are really working. Because right now we can only see, you know, this basic, I don't know how it relates to justice, but it may not, but it just seemed like a good way for me to perceive what it means to get more emanation, more becomes revealed.
Or the F-64 Club.
Right. I'll tell you something. I have this book a customer lent me of the Hubble telescope, and I was reading it on Shabbos, and just the beginning, I only got through a few pages, or the first page of the beginning, and it's just so phenomenal to see what it's like outside of our atmosphere, to see the rest of the deep space. That when we see things through our filters, and our filters are also the atmosphere, it's a whole different thing. We get outside of our filter of that atmosphere that like blocks so much. You can see the great, I mean, you just, what we've learned just from Hubble. I have no idea what's going to happen with this next telescope.
What's it called, the new one?
The Webb?
Yeah, the Webb. When are we going to get the first images from there?
I don't know. I haven't been paying attention. I stopped looking at the news. All I do is I wake up, and if I can see the world, I know that we're still here, and that's like enough. I gotta try to tune out some of that only in small bits. So I have no idea. I haven't been researching what's the new one. Do you know?
When
The last thing I saw was it took a photo of itself, was like, so it could like prove that certain things were deployed correctly. But that's the last picture I ever saw. I mean, it was a grainy, crappy, like self-portrait. But
it seems like we're exponentially getting closer and closer to like the grand finale. Just feels like that, like see back in time.
All right, gentlemen. It's 9:29. I think we'll stop there. Yeah. It's not easy, this. Know what he really wants. But okay, we're trying, right? We're trying.
what are we reading to next time?
Yeah, let's go up to 5, 6. Yeah, I think finish the chapter. Not that much. Maybe we'll start reading this guy's notes.
How long do you think we're going to continue the class? I know until we finish the book. How much longer do you think we need?
I don't know. If we're going to read every part of it, just based on the speed we go, like tonight we covered a lot of ground, right? We did how many pages? Yeah, I'm going to stop recording now.